In this video, I take 20 online questions about dungeon mastering and give answers based on my experience and perspective. A lot of D&D is subjective, so my approach to these topics is subjective as well. If content like this is useful or makes you think more about how to improve your game, be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. I release new content every week. So let's dive into the questions. Question number 1. What's the single biggest mistake new DMs make at the table? The biggest mistake I see new DMs make is over-prepping, but that's across the entire job of a dungeon master. Specifically at the table, I see new DMs panic when the players do something they don't expect and the DM kind of freaks out. They can get frustrated or almost irritated and overreact by either forcing the situation into railroading territory or they become increasingly antagonistic to the players. My advice is to take a breath, give some thought to what's happening. You're human, and if the players do something you don't expect, it's okay, especially if you don't respond immediately. So put your improv hat on and see how you can take the players' choices and extend them rather than fighting them back into the plan or path you already had in your mind. Question number 2. How much prep is too much prep? Too much prep is kind of like art. You know it when you feel it. You can tell when you've prepped too much when one or both of these two things happen. First, you get done with a game session or even the entire adventure and realize only 10% of what you prepped ever got discovered or consumed in-game. My experience has shown that roughly 30% of my prepared material ever gets consumed, so be sure to watch my related video on this topic. Second, and I think this is the more critical tell for knowing when you're prepping too much, is when prep becomes stressful or you dread it. For many DMs, prep is as much fun as running the game itself, but when getting ready for an adventure feels like work, and I'm talking the serious slog, dread, waking up on a Monday morning kind of work, that's when you're prepping too much. So tone it down, realize you only have to read one chapter ahead of the class, and don't feel like you have to predetermine every tiny detail in order for the game to be fun. Question number 3. What do you do when a player does something you completely didn't plan for? You say yes, and you figure it out. That's the honest answer. After 45 years of doing this, I still get surprised by players regularly, and I've made peace with that fact, and that those surprises will keep happening. So when something comes out of nowhere, I don't fight it. I ask myself, what makes the most sense in the moment? Then I go from there. Earlier in my career, when the players really threw me for a loop, I'd call a 5-minute break to collect my thoughts, but that only happened a couple of times, and that was many years ago. But if that's what you need at the gaming table, there's no shame in calling for a break. If you have to choose between the two, quality is more important than speed. What you want to avoid is letting the players see you get flustered. So stay calm, commit to the choice, and adapt. 9 times out of 10, the unexpected thing the players do ends up being more interesting than what you planned anyway. Question 4. Is it ever okay to fudge dice rolls? This is subjective and unique to each DM, so I'm going to share my own opinion on it and let you take it for what it is. I used to fudge dice rolls, but now I never do. I roll everything in the open, except for very specific rolls where the player isn't supposed to see the result, like when a rogue stealth checks. I think setting better targets for your rolls is an improved approach than artificially changing the outcome. And if you really want a particular outcome to occur in order to suit the situation and the story better, don't roll at all, just make the decision and move forward. Okay, 5th question. How do you handle a player who keeps derailing the adventure? There are various ways a player can derail an adventure, and most are innocuous or unintentional. Some are kind of cool when it actually adds to the story in an unexpected way. What I think the question pertains to, however, is when the player's behavior itself is the problem. So when a player keeps disrupting things, or does it in a way that is egregious or even malicious, I suggest you have a conversation with them one-on-one after the game. Ask questions first to find out what their intentions or motivations really are before you start making statements. On rare occasions, player behavior can be so bad that you have to address it right in the moment, right there at the table. Regardless of your age, remember that as the DM, you have to be the so-called adult in the room, so act like it. Be as mature as you can and be as constructive as possible, but don't be afraid to be direct. Don't make the player guess about your meaning or what should be the desired behavior. So this is a touchy subject, and there are a lot of ways to address it, but my final advice would be to stay mature and constructive while avoiding making it personal. Question 6. What's the most important thing a DM screen does for you? A DM screen does 2 things for me. First, and most importantly, it hides my notes and maps from the player's eyes. Second, it hides my roles, but I roll out in the open now for practically everything, so that's very rarely an issue. Question 7. How do you make an NPC memorable in just a few seconds? I make NPCs interesting by making them weird. Not in a negative way, but by making them unusual. I might give them an odd accent or unusual speech pattern. This is especially useful if I'm talking in the NPC's voice. I can also give them quirky fears or attractions. Perhaps that innkeeper keeps asking questions about one of the character's boots, almost like they have a boot fetish or something like that. Above all, an NPC should be immediately forgettable if they don't have a name. Give them a name, then be sure to write it down in your notes, especially if you made it up on the spot. NPCs don't need backstories or elaborate physical descriptions. If you make an NPC memorable, don't be surprised if the players remember them for a long time, so get their name right. Question 8. What's the best way to describe a room or location without boring everyone to death? Lead with what the characters would notice first, and then make it sensory. Not just what they see, but what they hear, what they smell, whether the air is cold or damp. Then stop talking. Give them 2 or 3 strong details and then let them ask questions. A lot of DMs make the mistake of front-loading setting descriptions with every detail they work hard to create. Players can't process all of that at once, and you'll watch their eyes glaze over. So think of your descriptions as bait. You're trying to get them curious enough to seek more detail. So for example, the room is cold and smells like smoke. In the center, there's a large stone table, and on it something is moving. Now, they're asking questions, which is what you want to have happen. Question 9. When should a DM just say no to a player's idea? You can say no when it would genuinely break the game for everyone else at the table, or when it goes against something that's been clearly established in the game's story. If a player wants their level 3 character to challenge the God King of the Realm to single combat in Session 2, that's a no, and the world itself can deliver that no. That's different from a DM saying no because they didn't think of the idea first or because it complicates their plans. A good rule of thumb is this. Is my reason for saying no about protecting the game, or is it about protecting my prep? If it's the second one, I need to get out of my own way and find a yes, or at least a yes, and here's what happens next. Here's one final word of advice. If you make a ruling along these lines, don't be afraid to explain your reasoning. Because I said so is the last thing a good DM should ever say. This video is covering a lot of ground, but there is still a ton of questions out there that budding DMs need answers to. If you have questions you'd like to ask, or if you're an experienced DM with your own perspective on the questions raised in this video, be sure to post it in the comments. Question 10. How do you keep combat from dragging on too long? A few things work well together. First, keep encounter size manageable. Monsters that have already taken significant damage should start making decisions that reflect this, whether they flee, surrender, or fight more desperately. And honestly, keep the pressure on players to make their decisions quickly. If someone spends 3 minutes on their turn because they can't decide what to do, give them a 10-second count next time. Don't be harsh about it, just give them a reminder that time is passing in game 2. The other big one is knowing when to call it. So if combat has clearly turned in the party's favor and you're just grinding through hit points, describe a dramatic finishing moment and find a plausible way to end it. Nobody needs to watch the party dispatch the last 2 goblins one at a time, so wrap it up and move on. Question 11. What's the difference between running a published adventure and running a homebrew campaign? At the table, there's hardly any discernible difference at all. The biggest differences pertain to prep. So with a published adventure, you've got a lot of the heavy lifting done for you. The maps exist, the encounters are laid out, and the story is all there. Your job is to adapt it to your table because your players probably won't follow the exact path the writers of the published adventure assume they would. Read the whole thing before you run any of it so you're not surprised by the material. With homebrew, you have complete creative freedom and complete creative responsibility. Nothing exists until you make it, so that's exciting, and it can also be a lot of work, depending on how much depth you put into your prep process. The advantage is that everything in your world is already calibrated to your players because you've hopefully built it with them in mind. I've done both for decades, and I find real value in each approach. They're just different kinds of work. Question 12. How has your DMing style changed over the years? I've gotten a lot more comfortable with uncertainty. When I started, I felt like I needed to have an answer for everything, and if a player asked something I hadn't planned for, I'd panic a little. Now I've learned that I don't know yet, but let's find out is a perfectly legitimate thing to say in the moment. I've also become much more interested in what the players bring to the table versus what I bring. Early in my career, I was probably more invested in my own world building than in what the players were actually doing inside of it. That flipped somewhere along the way. Now, the most interesting part of any campaign is watching players make choices I didn't anticipate and seeing where that takes us. In the end, though, I'd say my confidence when improvising is what has changed the most. Lucky question 13. What's the one rule you've always found is more trouble than it's worth? Encumbrance, hands down. I have tried across multiple editions and multiple decades to make encumbrance feel like it adds something meaningful to the game, and in theory it should, but resource management is interesting and I see value in it, especially if your players dig that kind of thing. But in practice, at least for the majority of players I've worked with, tracking exactly how much everything weighs and whether the party's fighter can carry that extra suit of armor kills the momentum of the game and creates bookkeeping that nobody wants to do. I've used simplified versions, I've tried various house rules, and eventually I just stopped enforcing it unless a situation makes it genuinely relevant, like someone trying to sprint while wearing plate armor and carrying a huge bag of gold. Common sense handles most of what encumbrance rules are designed to address, so I go with what is plausible in a broad sense and ignore any more detail than that. Question 14. How do you handle a player whose character dies? I have an approach that is information forward. So during combat, if things are going poorly, I make sure the player knows it or at least has good hints about it. I don't spring gotchas on the party with monsters that are overly capable of killing them without them being a fair fight or at least some warning. So that cavern strewn with mutilated bodies is a pretty good indication the monster lurking just out of sight has a high likelihood of wiping them out. Second, I roll my dice out in the open so the players know it's not me killing them, it's the dice. That alone has helped players deal with character death because it prevents them from taking it personally. If the player does take it hard, I show in-game respect for their loss and don't discount it. I let them experience that grief as if it's real, because for the player, sometimes it absolutely can be. Question 15. What's the best way to introduce a new player to D&D or table? I run the Teens D&D group through my local library, and for the vast majority of them, they're playing D&D for the very first time. So I try to get them up to speed as best I can and as quickly as I can without making the other more experienced players die from boredom. This is one area where I'm not a fan of 5e compared to old school rules or Shadow Dark because 5e takes forever to generate new characters. I make sure the new player rolls up their stats with dice the old-fashioned way because that's a memorable experience. But we try to defer a lot of the other details so they can get to playing as quickly as possible. We fill in the other stuff later as we play. Question 16. Between AD&D, 5e, or Old School Essentials, which is the most fun to run? That depends on what kind of fun you're after, and I say this having run all three extensively. AD&D has a complexity and a texture to it that I still find deeply satisfying, and I suspect some of that comes down to nostalgia, but I know that all that detail isn't for everyone. Old School Essentials captures that same spirit in a much cleaner package, and I find it remarkably easy to prep and run. 5e has its pluses during actual gameplay, such as Ascending Armor class, but I find it's the most long-winded and challenging for new players to get into. So if you're asking which one I personally enjoy running the most right now, I'd tell you Old School Essentials or Basic Expert, because they get out of my way and let me focus on the action. But the honest answer is that much of D&D is subjective, so the best system is the system you like best. Question 17. How do you keep track of everything going on at the table without losing your mind? I don't. I think being mentally prepared before the game helps me stay sane during the game. So the night before a game, I read through the session notes from the last session so I can get up to speed on where the party left off. Then about an hour before the game, I review in my head what's likely to transpire, or at least what's nearby and where the party is likely to go. During the game itself, I keep short and quick notes of the NPCs they meet, the monsters they face, and the gear they acquire, and any quest level objectives added to their list or ones they've accomplished. If I feel momentarily overwhelmed, I verbally stall just enough to let my brain catch up in the background. A lot of this just comes from experience, to be honest, and that's something you have to acquire the hard way by putting in the hours. And usually the following morning, I write up my session notes from what transpired the night before. These notes are typically a single typewritten page. The final piece of advice I have, though, is to keep your sessions a bit shorter, like 2 to 3 hours max, or if they're going longer than that, definitely take breaks. Question 18. What's your go-to trick when the energy at the table starts to drop? Honestly, I don't think that has ever happened at any of my games other than when combat drags or when one player is interacting with an NPC and the other characters aren't involved. Sometimes long combats can get boring, especially if there are more than 4 or 5 players, but that's about the only time I can think of when energy or enthusiasm seems to drop off. So my only tip would be kind of expedite it, get to the end as quickly as you can. Question 19. How do you build tension before a big boss fight? I don't deliberately set out to build tension per se, but as an author of 4 fantasy novels and 1 murder mystery, foreshadowing is kind of second nature to me. I guess in that sense, I'm building tension unconsciously and somewhat automatically. Whenever I advise new DMs, though, I recommend they make sure that the party at least has some hints that something big, bad, and evil may be lurking around the corner. Surprises aren't always fun in D&D, especially when that surprise can quickly end in a TPK. So if someone is going to walk into the boxing ring with Mike Tyson, they should at least have a talking magpie whisper in their ear, "You do know he's the heavyweight champion, right?" Last question, number 20. What's the one piece of advice you wish someone had given you when you started DMing? Prep, don't plan. I've talked about this several times in my videos because the difference between prepping and planning is huge. Planning leads to railroading and unmet expectations. It also puts a lot more improvisation load on the DM when they have to handle the party going east when your plan assumed they'd go west. So prepping leads to flexibility and fun on both sides of the DM screen. So prep, don't plan. Thanks for watching. I hope this Q&A was helpful to you. Don't forget to leave a comment of any questions you may have or if you have suggestions for other DMs. Meanwhile, have fun, stay cool, and keep your dice rolling.